Part 22. Altitude Sickness. Chapter 1. The Invisible Wall. The transition from the lush, oxygen-rich valley to the razor-thin air of the high peaks was not a gradual shift, but a violent, unseen assault on the senses for Ilara. The sudden change of atmospheric pressure hit her head like a physical blow from a heavy mallet, a rhythmic pounding that synchronized with the frantic, shallow drumming of her heart. It began as a dull, pulsing ache behind the eyes, a localized pressure that suggested her brain was trying to expand against the rigid confines of her skull. Within minutes, this ache blossomed into a heavy, swelling nausea that threatened to upend her very resolve. This was altitude sickness, the dreaded mountain malady that the locals called the Saroche. It was a physiological betrayal that turned the body into a prison and the mind into a fog-choked labyrinth. Every cell in her body seemed to be screaming for a resource that the environment refused to provide. The air here was not just cold, it was empty. It lacked the substance required to fuel the furnace of her muscles, leaving her feeling like a machine running on the dregs of a dying battery. As she stood on the narrow, wind-swept ridge, the world began to lose its sharp edges. The crisp lines of the horizon blurred into watercolor, smears of gray and indigo. Every thought she had carefully curated for this journey, the topographical maps she had memorized, the safety protocols for weather shifts, the deeply personal reasons for her ascent, fled from her mind like startled birds. In their place was a hollow, echoing weariness that felt heavier than her 60-pound pack. Her purpose, which had felt so vital and indestructible just an hour ago, was suddenly killed by the overwhelming urge to simply lie down in the snow and let the cold claim her. Chapter 2. The Dissonant Mind. In her disoriented state, Ilara's mind began to translate her physical suffering into a surreal, auditory landscape. The silence of the high peaks was never truly silent, but now it was being filtered through a broken psyche. It was as if a grand piano were being played in her subconscious, but the keys were fragmented, out of tune, and missing their ivory. The melody was a jarring sequence of minor chords that refused to align, a discordance that mirrored the misfiring of her synapses. She could almost see the music as jagged, black shapes dancing in the periphery of her vision. Then came the sound of a flutter-tongued flute, a rapid, shaking tremor that suggested the deep internal chill of her bones. It wasn't just the wind whistling through the vents of her parka, it was the sound of her own nervous system struggling to maintain its frequency against the thinning air. The vibrations seemed to rattle her teeth. She stopped abruptly, her knees buckling under the sudden weight of her own gravity, and leaned her shoulder against a slab of bitter, frost-rimed stone. The world did not just wobble, it began to tilt and swiftly spin in great, nauseating arcs. The horizon line, once her steady guide, became a mocking, jagged streak of light. This was the final challenge she had feared most. Not the physical verticality of the climb or the technical demands of the ice, but the sudden darkness she held within. It was the moment where the external mountain met the internal abyss, and she was forced to face the isolation of her own fading consciousness. Chapter 3. The Interior Struggle. Ilara closed her eyes and gripped the stone until the grit bit into her palms through her liners. She forced herself to breathe, a conscious, agonizing effort that required her full concentration. Inhale for 4, hold for 2, exhale for 6. She focused on the center of the nausea, visualizing it as a dark, oily tide she could command to recede. She spoke to her own blood, demanding it carry what little oxygen it held to her vital centers. Slowly, the spinning slowed. The strength began to return to her calves and thighs, a sluggish, prickly heat rising to combat the numbness. The sickness did not vanish, but it started to fade into the background, becoming a manageable hum rather than a deafening roar. The final promise that the journey had written in her blood was not one of defeat, but of endurance. A powerful decision was made in that silence. She would not turn back. She would rather be a permanent part of this mountain than a living failure in the valley below. The oxygen grew thinner with every passing second. Her lungs demanded a breath that the atmosphere simply could not provide, a cruel exchange where every gasp felt like inhaling shots of dry, pulverized ice. There was a heavy weight upon her breast, as if the mountain itself were pressing down on her ribs, testing the structural integrity of her will. Above her, the sky was a vast, unrelenting blue, a shade so deep it bordered on black, beautiful and utterly indifferent to her struggle for life. Chapter 4. the ghost of the mountain. Her senses continued to falter in the hypoxic environment. The smell of the air was metallic, sharp with the scent of ozone and old coins. Her limbs grew numb, a terrifying detachment that made her feel like a puppet master pulling at fraying strings. She watched her own hand reach out to plant a trekking pole, feeling as though the hand belonged to someone else entirely. The mountain spirits, if they existed in the way the old legend suggested, were taking their heavy toll, demanding a payment of ego and flesh for every foot of progress. Each step upward felt like moving through miles of lead. She was dragging herself through a mire of frozen dust and scree that seemed designed to sap her momentum and break her spirit. Every vision she had of the path ahead, the clear route she had studied on her maps, dissolved into shadows and mistrust. The granite walls around her seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, whispering her name in voices caught from centuries of gales. It was a cold reminder of the ancient game played between the earth and those who sought to conquer its heights. It was a game where human spirit often faltered and then failed, leaving behind nothing but bleached gear and cautionary tales. She could feel the weight of those who had come before her, the explorers, the dreamers, the desperate, their ghostly footprints invisible in the snow but heavy in the air. She was walking through a graveyard of ambitions. Chapter 5. The Shroud of White. The blue of heaven, once so inviting, turned to a stinging, blinding white as a sudden bank of clouds began to descend from the higher peaks. They wrapped her in a damp, freezing shroud, erasing the landmarks, the sun, and the very concept of direction. She lost track of the morning, lost track of the light, existing only in a shifting, suffocating cloud where the only reality was the next 6 inches of rock in front of her face. Her fingers, encased in heavy, insulated gloves, clutched at a jagged icy shelf. She could see her knuckles turning white, even through the fabric, a desperate anchor in a world that wanted to cast her off. The vertigo returned, briefly suggesting that down was actually up, and she had to squeeze her eyes shut to keep from leaning into the void. She fought the hollow phantom of herself, the part of her that was tired, the part that was rational, the part that begged for her to turn and walk away, while she still had the strength to descend. That phantom was louder than the wind, whispering with the voice of her mother, her friends, her past self, telling her that there was no shame in survival. It told her that the mountain would be here tomorrow, but she might not. Chapter 6. The Symphony of the Gale. A symphony of dissonance arrived on the back of a sudden 50-mile-per-hour gust. The wind sounded like a cello bowed with jagged glass, a high, screeching lament that tore at her ears and threatened to rip the goggles from her face. In this high-altitude theater, only frantic desperation seemed to thrive. The mountain let no weary wanderer pass freely. It demanded a transformation, a total shedding of the valley self, that person who needed comfort, safety, and certainty. The thinness of the world was like a veil, tearing at the edges of her sight. Peripheral shadows danced and darted, making her flinch and reach for her ice axe. She saw figures in the mist that weren't there, tall, shimmering giants, made of spindrift. The courage of her heart, usually so robust, began to fail against the crushing, physical pressure of the coming night. The temperature was dropping fast, and she knew the death zone was not just a height, but a state of being. She tasted the copper iron on her tongue, the unmistakable flavor of extreme physical exertion and primal animal fear. It was a song of isolation to be sung in a place where only thinning ghosts were left to hear. All the logic she had brought from the valley, the training, the heart rate monitors, the calculated risks, stayed below. Those things were discarded like a heavy, useless garment on the trail. In the face of this raw, elemental reality, her fancy gear was just colorful plastic and nylon. Chapter 7. The Alchemical Spark. But deep within the marrow of her bone, in a place that the cold could not reach and the lack of oxygen could not dim, a spark of stubborn fire began to bloom. It was a small, defiant thing, no bigger than a guttering candle flame in a hurricane, yet it refused to be quiet or alone. It refused to yield to the oppression of the gloom. It was the primal I am that preceded all other thoughts, a core of identity that the altitude could not reach. She began to find a rhythm in her ragged breath. It was no longer a struggle, but a cadence. She timed her movements to the pulse in her ears. Inhale, step, exhale, plant, inhale, step, exhale, plant. It became a mantra. The mountain was trying to break her into pieces, so she became a single, repeating action, She was no longer Ilara the climber. She was the step and the breath. It was a balance struck between life and death, a walking meditation on the very edge of the world. Every flickering candle of her awareness remained lit, fueled by a sheer, stubborn refusal to go out. She began to realize that the sickness wasn't an enemy to be fought, but a condition to be accepted. Like the wind and the cold, the nausea was just part of a landscape. Once she stopped fighting the feeling, she could use that energy to move her feet. Chapter 8. Master of the Mountain. The mountain stopped being an enemy and became a mirror for her soul. It reflected back the Titan that lived in her mind, the version of herself she had always hoped existed, but had never truly tested. This was the crucible. She was regaining her focus, regaining her control. She was leaving every doubt and fear behind, shedding them like dead skin on the jagged rocks of the upper face. The nausea finally ebbed, receding like tides upon a distant shore, leaving behind a clarity of stone, a hard, indestructible perspective. She did not feel the burden of the climb any more, nor the weight of the air. She felt light, almost as if she were floating above the terrain. She was standing on the threshold of the summit, and the isolation no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a homecoming. She was the only living thing, for miles, in any direction, a solitary spark of consciousness in a universe of ice. The music of the spheres, which had been so discordant and broken, began to mend into a glorious celestial harmony. The broken piano keys found their chords, and the flute stilled its tremor, settling into a long, sustained note of peace. As the jagged paths and rocky climbs began to descend into the quiet shadows of her past, she reached the highest point of the ridge. She stood atop the world with vision clear, the sky now a deep violet black that only the high places know. The clouds had parted, revealing a sea of white cotton far below, pierced only by the tips of lesser peaks. The sickness was but a memory of the climb, a necessary tax paid for the view. She was beyond the reach of trembling or of fear, a master of the mountain and of time. The silence here was not a vacuum. It was a song of ultimate triumph. She breathed in the thin, holy air and, for the first time in her life, felt completely whole. The air grows thin and turns to empty space. A heavy mallet strikes against her head. The valley's lushness leaves without a trace. As nausea swirls where oxygen has fled, the mind becomes a fog-choked, broken maze, where ghosts of climbers haunt the frozen scree. The horizon blurs beneath a weary haze, and shadows dance in silent mockery. She grips the stone and breathes a rhythmic prayer to find the fire within her shivering bone. She sheds the self that gasps for thicker air, and clings the strength to face the height alone. The summit waits beneath a violet sky, where discord turns to peace and holy light. The mountain's tax was paid to climb this high, a master now of time and frozen white.